I just saw a comment on a romance scammer video that really just, wow, really speaks into what I've been talking about. And it's talking about the particular person who has been involved in this romance scam from the point of they think that there's this other person that they need to spend all this money on because they're in love with them. And the person said, at this point, this person is not a victim, they're now a volunteer. Uh, and that's, I think, really the path to releasing victimhood is to, number one, to be in your victim state. I mean, if something bad has happened to you, if something wrong has happened, if you've had a bad situation in life, if somebody's been mean or hurt you or whatever may have happened, you are a victim in that moment, and you are allowed to express that. You are allowed to live that victim moment. You're allowed to feel that pain. You're allowed to feel the helplessness in it. You're allowed to feel the hurt in it and the disillusionment and all the other things that can really happen through that. But you can stay stuck in that. And what happens if you stay stuck in a victim mode is once you see yourself as a victim, when that situation goes away, which most situations eventually do, you start looking for another situation where you can now be the victim because that's who you see yourself as. So you've met people like this, and perhaps you've been like that. I've been like that, where I have had states where I was a victim, and then because I decided that that's who I was, or that's all I knew, or that's how I got fed attention to, I started looking for, and I'm not saying like I did a Craigslist ad or a Google search for, I'm saying I just consciously, my brain was looking for another victim situation for me to step into. And anything you look for, you're going to find. So the path for a victim to let go of that is to begin to understand that they are in a volunteer role of it. That whatever's happened to you only has the hold on you that you give it. You're even able to, and this is hard, and it certainly takes a lot, you're able to, even in a state where perhaps you're still being victimized, you are able to not see yourself as a victim at that point. And those are the people that we've really seen as heroes, I think, in the past, or those that, like Harriet Tubman, some of these amazing people, Martin Luther King Jr., and some of the queer rights activists and the women's rights activists and all these other amazing social changes that have happened at a time when that person was still being victimized, but they no longer volunteered to the victimization. They realized, perhaps early on, or it took them a while to understand that they were complicit in it. I was at a retreat recently, a Tantra retreat for gay men, and a gentleman of color said something that just, oh my goodness, went straight to my soul. I was so glad that he and another gentleman of color felt comfortable enough to let us know about their rage, because of what they've been through in life, because of how society has said that they're this different, how society has put them aside because of a certain marker that society has decided is relevant. That being the color of their skin, and that's a choice from society. But something he said really, wow, went to the core, and he said that he found himself and others in the same situation having to I can't remember the words he said, but he had to bolster up the concept or the paradigm or the mindset or the viewpoint that people, that white people were the ones that had the most power, and that people of color should be subjugated. So he had to buy into that concept in order to keep himself safe. In other words, I can't remember quite how he said it, but he found himself having to convince, and this is his personal experience related through me, so there you go. Through my filter, I'm trying to be as honest about it and really look at it as fully as I can about how he found himself having to substantiate that viewpoint in order to keep himself safe. And so that ties right into this, that sometimes being a victim is about keeping yourself safe, but once you realize that that is a voluntary action, then you can start looking for places and ways to where you no longer have to volunteer. And perhaps let that start, and perhaps, change your life to a point where you're no longer in a situation where you have to volunteer to that. I mean, that's the hard thing about victimhood, is that sometimes people are still there. Sometimes people are still under physical or mental or emotional or sexual or financial, not hardship, but actual, what's the word? They're still being harmed in those ways right now at this point. So this is certainly not a talk about that person feeling even more guilt. I mean, it is wrong to be victimized. It is wrong for someone to establish their rights over your human rights, especially when someone says, I'm allowed to have these human rights, but you're not allowed to have these human rights because of A, B, C, or D. It doesn't matter. If they see those rights as intrinsic and basic for them, that means all people should have the same rights. And those are rights that don't harm someone else. So it's important to look at that for sure, because some people are still in that state, and I was certainly in that state for a long time. Especially like if you were, a child and you're growing up in a house of abuse. You don't have that many resources. You don't have that many places to go. Or say you're married to someone that's abusive, especially if you have children, and especially if they've ostracized you from your family. That's absolutely a situation. I mean, that is valid. But until you can understand that that is also a role that, at least mentally, you are volunteering to, you can't allow your beautiful human mind and spirit to find ways to move you out of that harmful space. If you're in that victim mindhood and you see that as the only possibility, then that's the little cage that you will run from, that you'll run around in. And once you can start to give yourself the allowance to think that, how am I buying into this, and how am I seeing this as correct? Until you can start looking at that and understanding how you're perhaps facilitating that. And I don't mean that in any victim shaming way, but it's the only way to, in my point of view, in my opinion, in my life experience, it's the only way to move out of that victim state physically. I mean, that's the first thing. If you are being victimized right now, the most important thing is to move yourself out of the physical situation of being victimized in whatever shape, way, or form. And in my concept of God and the universe and the divine, there's always alternatives. There's always a path, and we may not be able to think of it. And that's why I think the divine and spirit and God are essential in people's lives, because they can create opportunities, and they can create new mindsets for yourself, or even change thoughts and feelings and viewpoints of others to give you avenues to a different way. So it's about, number one, realizing your own buy-in or volunteering to the situation. And then number two, allowing yourself the idea that it makes sense that you wouldn't know what to do. That's okay. It's okay for you to not know how. And perhaps that's not even your job to know how. Perhaps your job is to start seeing yourself in a different light, and to start opening yourself to the idea that there could be a different way, and that your brain, your spirit, your body, your mind are smart enough and in tuned enough to know what that better opportunity is when it happens, when it comes up, and to have the courage to take it. Because change is scary. Even change that might possibly help us can be terrifying. Change is one of the biggest things that we are just generationally taught is bad and harmful and scary and life-threatening, because we come from a past where it was all about the village. And many of the biblical stories we hear of are really centered around the idea that community was life, and to be ostracized from community was death. That's where a lot of it, even like the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, was really about strangers not being accepted and taken care of, and then being pushed out of the walls of the city. And so much of the idea and the thought and the paradigm back then was about that, because you would literally die out in the desert by yourself. You wouldn't have sources of water and food and places to rest. And so we've taken that generationally, and we've placed that into ourselves, and reconceived it in our modern landscape, in our modern language, to where change is scary and change is life-threatening. And so for many people, until they start to venture out and learn how to build that courage muscle, they feel like they're maybe not worthy of change, or not courageous enough for change, or don't even know that it's even possible for themselves. So that's where healing for the victim and changing the victim situation begins, is to realize the possibility that there could be another way, not knowing what the other way is, but just the idea that there is even something possible. And maybe ask yourself the what if question. And what if this isn't true? And what if there's a different way? And what if there is a situation waiting for me? And what if there is someone or something or somewhere that can help me? And it's really important in that question to not be looking for a savior, because I believe it's a famous Chinese quote that when you save someone, you are now responsible for them the rest of your life, which is a whole new victim state. So realize that there might be people placed on your path that might help you, but it's not about being saved by another person. It's just about resources from the divine opening up to move you along the highest path to what you feel is possible for yourself, and what you might have faith in. So I think that's really important in the victim mindset, is to come to realization of your own facilitation in that victimhood. And that can be really hard, and that's usually how victimizers get you, is by playing on the card of that you were a willing victim, that you were part of it. A lot of sexual abuse victims, especially when it happens at a younger age before they're cognitively able to understand that things were done to them that were wrong. There was sometimes, not always, but sometimes there might have been physical pleasure or pleasure of being accepted or pleasure of, having someone that cared about them, even though it was a wrong care. There might have been some type of pleasure signal attached to that. So then, because there is that happening within that victimization story, and this happened to me in some ways, that I was complicit in it, and perhaps it was even my fault. Perhaps I asked for it, perhaps I needed it, and perhaps it was okay. And then your own internalized guilt and shame comes up to where, and perhaps you feel like you still need this, so you go into secret to continue this pattern of abuse and victimization happening so that you can get that need fulfilled for yourself in the only way that you know how, and the only way that you've experienced. Because that's really, when we stay in our own minds, we stay in our own brains, the only paths that we can see, the only things that we can conceive of are those things that we've experienced. But especially when we're very young, we've had very little experience. And that's why it's important, especially if you don't have guardians who truly care about you, is to tap in as early as you can to a spiritual or divine source that's pure and loving, so that they can give you the inspirations of how you can take care of yourself and have a different mindset. I think the veil between the divine and children is pretty thin, because they're pretty close to being in total source, and they don't have all of the rules and regulations and dogma attached in their brain, all these neural pathways that have been built, giving them all these rules and regulations. They're more open to what might be possible, so and one of the most important things to do is to understand your signs, in your body and in your mind, of what is for your highest and what isn't. I know for me that I work with the angels, and when they're excited, I get like these little tickles, is a French term called frisson, and it's like these little needles of excitement that I'll feel on my shoulders. And when it's caution or not for me, I'll feel like a knot in my stomach. I might even get like a little indigestion and have to burp to relieve it. And I know that when I'm learning something new, I'll feel like this, I'll feel like my third eye really opening, and I might even experience a headache or physical or mental fatigue. And so it's knowing those things within your own mind and body and spirit, and realizing that, your body is built to experience pain and pleasure, and then pain and pleasure are built into you so that you can know what is to your benefit and what isn't to your benefit. Most lovely scent right here. And, for a lot of people, those wires between pain and pleasure have really been crossed in a lot of ways. And so it can be difficult, but once you really start to differentiate between what is for me and what is my personal path of rightness, or that's the wrong way to put it, but what is to my highest calling, once you understand that, and higher calling is not always fun or easy, but you'll always feel the impassionment and the energy for it. You'll be pulled to it. It's almost like the difference between pulling and pushing. When I'm inspired to do something truly from the divine, I'm like pulled to it. I can't do anything else but. When there's something I think logically needs to happen, I'm constantly pushing. So it's the difference when you're pulled, there's like this outside energy that ramps me up. And when I'm pushing, I'm having to use my own energy. I'm having to spend it. And then eventually I get spent. And anyway, this has been a long rant about victimhood and understanding if you're volunteering in it, and perhaps how to move past all that. Because the first step is really understanding your buy-in on that, how you're buying into that idea that you are a victim and that victimization is okay. And sometimes you just have to call a spade, and sometimes you have to go so on the other side. Perhaps it's a family member in your heart, you're afraid of being mad at them. And sometimes you have to cut them off and be really super mad at them in order to really get a full scope and understanding of what's actually occurred. And then you can make the decision of, have I gone too far in that or have I not? And what is your highest calling in stepping out of the idea of cultural or familial or obligation? That the only thing you're obligated to is to go into your highest calling and be your most authentic, inspirational self so that you give others the allowance to do the same and help to be part of this beautiful world rather than be part of showing people that they need to stay in victim roles. So that's my rant, my experience, and love, peace, and release.